listen to fall to the floor.
Hello, and welcome back to another pen talk. This video is going to focus on nibs and replacing nibs and what nibs can work in what pens. A lot of fellow pen enthusiasts have swapped nibs in pens, putting what one might say a more expensive nib into a less expensive pen to improve the writing quality, changing what can be done, fine to medium to broad to double broad to italic. There's a lot of different changes that you can do, and that's the fun part about fountain pens is they're customizable, they're hackable, they're analog devices, so you have choices. So what we have here in the top row are number 6 nibs, and below that are number 5 nibs. A lot of viewers have talked about, what size nib goes into what pen, and my feeling has always been that number 5s and number 6s are more of a general classification. There isn't a extremely specific set of metrics that determine it. There is a wide range that from what I found between manufacturers as to what may be called a 5, if they even call it a 5 or a 6, but one can see here that a size difference is substantial. So these first two are nibs that I've taken out of Jinhao pens. The one down below is from the 992. And those of you that have watched some of my other videos have known that I've hacked those nibs, and I put in a Knox nib, which is over here on the far right. This is a Knox nib here. And the ones in the middle are a recent acquisition that I got on eBay. They're the calligraphy nibs, or bent nibs. I really enjoyed the bent nib on my D-like, so I wanted to experiment more and put that nib into some of my existing pens to see whether I like that writing experience there. The other set here is from X450. It also could be from a 159, a 750. There's a lot of Jinhaos that take the larger nib, as well as there's Jinhaos that take the smaller nib. So let's just take a close-up look at these nibs. So on the number 6 nib, the bending is quite extreme, the way I see that. It certainly does look closer to a Fude nib, which I have an example of that on a Sailor pen. If you compare it against the Knox nibs, one of the most obvious differences is tipping material, but the Knox nib is considered a double broad, and I've already said that I think that's more of a broad. Both of these are interesting in their two-tone. Interesting type of engravings on there. If we take a look at the number 5, the bent nib is not as severe. It's very similar to what I like on the D-like, so I'm looking forward to putting that into a 992. And here's the Knox nib, which I've put into a 992. And as you can see, that tipping material is just substantial. And this is also considered a double broad from the seller and labeled that way from Knox. These are the way they came in. Well, actually, that's an oblique double broad. Yeah, they're both oblique double broads, and since I didn't notice that, they're not as oblique as I would like. It's more of a very subtle oblique as far as how it's done. I put in the bent nibs into. As I mentioned, this is a 450. This is a nice pen that Larry Baronis sent me a while ago. It's well done. The 450 is a workhorse pen. It's obviously not a light pen. Pull off cap, and as you can see, that bent nib fits well. So the first 450 I tried it in, it didn't fit at all. There was a gap between the feed and the nib, and that would have precluded it from being used. In the 992, it fit fairly well without any concern. So this is the X450 where I couldn't put the bent nib in. There's a different feed on this one. You know, that's the way the nib should fit. And here's the feed that's on. I think this one's a newer one and it's an older one. It's hard to really tell. I may have been able to play around with the feed and play around with the nib, but since I found a pen that it fit in without any issues, I decided to use that. We had these differences in nib sizes and feeds between an X450, which is technically the same model. It's why I always caution people on just making an assumption that if it's a number 5 or a number 6 nib that you can swap in and out any type of nibs in those pens. You may have to do a little bit more hacking in order to get it to fit properly and write properly. So we're going to ink these up and play around with them, and then we'll come back with a writing sample. This is the Sailor that I bought on Amazon at a good price from my perspective. And it's still for sale on Amazon. You can see it shows you the way the nib is bent. And this is referred to as a Fude nib, obviously not packaged or designed for global sales. This is focused on the Japanese market. You know, it came with some cartridges. I don't think it came with a converter for the price that I paid. I don't know whether that shows up so much in the camera, but it's a very dark blue. Very classic cigar shape, and gee, what an interesting little button there at the bottom. Kind of reminds you of 992, Pro Color, you know, things like that. So it's an unscrew cap, and we can see the nib. And it is definitely a bent nib. I think one of the things is has a little bit of a stronger angle on the bend. So let's compare this to my other bent nibs. The Sailor one is on the top, and there's your number 5 in the middle and your number 6 at the bottom. So they are a slightly different design. When I got the Sailor and tried to use it, it wasn't a nib that I liked, so therefore it went back into the box, and until I started thinking about bent nibs, it stayed there, so maybe we'll see how it compares. One of the things to be aware of when you're swapping nibs or changing nibs is how the nib fits inside the pen. This pen at the bottom is a basic 992 with the original nib in it. The next one has the Knox IBB nib, which is a double broad oblique. And then at the top one is the bent nib. And as you can see, the bent nib is almost at the very top of the cap. And the nibs are all the same size nibs, so why would that be the case? So if you flip it over and look at the feed, you'll notice that I couldn't put the feed all the way in, so the feed is sticking out. So the nib works fine because the distance between the end of the feed and the nib is the same in all these pens, but just that feed wouldn't fit any further into the section when I put in the bent nib. So something just to keep in mind when you're playing with nibs, and also when you talk about nib sizing and how it fits into individual pens, you'll find there's a lot of inconsistencies, uniquenesses in the nibs that you're using, even though they may look almost the same, and the feed and section that you're using to accommodate your nib. These ones to do writing with live, so I just thought I'd do this little chart put together here to give you some ideas of the way these 4 different nibs work on paper. So this is holding the pen completely vertical, like this. This is holding the pen at 45 degrees and stroking down. And this is holding the pen at as low an angle as I can get to without dragging the feed. And then this is reverse writing with the other side of the nib. So before I did this comparison, I have to say that I thought the Sailor Prophet was extremely wide and broad and laid down a much thicker line than the other ones. And I thought the 450 with the number 6 in it was also much wider than the 992, but when you put these together, the differences aren't that great. But I think, you know, even a small difference, like you can see the 45-degree angle on the 992, let me get back to my pointer, is certainly what might call a broad line. This might be closer to a double broad, and this might be a triple broad. When they're all vertical, they're all pretty much the same, including the Delight, which doesn't have as much as a bend to it, which we see when we do the angle writing. It's also a different ink. All these other ones have soda pop in it. In reverse, they write more consistently than what I thought. The number 6 nib on the number 6 nib on the 450, I had trouble with it reverse when I first started using it, but maybe because of the flow that I've gotten before I did the reverse, it had a lot of ink there in the nib. So the 992 always has worked well in reverse. So did the Sailor Prophet, and so did the Delight New Moon. The Delight New Moon doesn't get as wide, so it pretty much goes from a medium to maybe a broad, or, you know, a small size broad on the Japanese side. One of the things that to me impressed me first with the Delight was the original nib in there was extra fine, finer than I like, and I wanted something a little bit better to my taste, and I like laying down a little bit more ink. I used to read some discussions on the Fountain Pen Network about, you know, people want to go fine and extra fine. They get a nib that's too wide, they don't like it, but lays down too much ink, and then other people say, I like it that way, and I started out with fine and extra fine and then learned to enjoy that. You do have to let things dry, as you can see up here, and this was written with my Caligoo 316, so, and that has Violet Storm in it. But overall, all of these nibs are smooth, and as you can see, you can lay down a decent amount of ink with either of these 3 nibs. They're all considered Fude nibs, and it's basically just a question of size and an angle. So these pens are available in a lot of different places, and when I did my research on Amazon, there's 2 different angles of Fude nibs that they sell in the Sailor pens, and they actually have a series of Sailor pens, not the Prophet, but less expensive ones that are under $10. So to me, that's kind of a no-brainer if you wanted to explore these types of nibs. Live writing. So we're going to just use this nib normally. And that's a broad line. I'm very happy that the feed keeps up with laying down so much ink. And if we move it vertically, it's still smooth, but it's definitely a finer line. And if you go all the way down at an angle, it gets very broad. So again, is this nib for everybody? I would say no. Is it a nib that I think everybody should experiment and try? Absolutely. Yeah, that's the fun of fountain pens. The variety, you know, what you can do with them. I mean, that's just a nice wet writer, and these are related to the brush nibs that people use for doing Chinese characters with, and this is kind of like a fountain pen way of getting that same type of look. I mean, the 450 definitely appears to be wetter. I mean, that's incredibly wide line. And you know, vertical is usable. You know, it's wider than the smaller nib on the 992, but as you can see, it still lays down a really decent amount of ink. So a lot of people talk about the 450s being wet. I never really played around with them, but I have to agree that they are wet. So hopefully you've enjoyed this 200th video of mine, and I just thought I had to do something cool. So Bent Nibs, the name sounds cool, so I thought I would do that. So thank you for watching. Apologize for that. I'm writing over the camera, so you're not going to get, you know, as good control of the writing, and can't control my writing that well anyways. So enjoy your pen. Until later, the end. Nice ink.